Last week, the Republican Party had two major victories when it comes to their push for tax reform in the United States. So first, their legislation cleared the Senate Finance Committee in a 14-12 vote, and it also passed in the House along party lines with only 13 Republicans going against their own party. Now, since this was strictly a partisan vote and 0 Democrats went along with the Republicans here, surprisingly, President Trump took to Twitter to denounce Democrats, saying, quote, "Big win today in the House for GOP tax cuts and reform. 227 to 205, 0 Dems. They want to raise taxes much higher, but not for our military. If Democrats were not such obstructionists and understood the power of lower taxes, we would be able to get many of their ideas into bill." Now, keep in mind that the president is expecting them to go along with a tax plan that's political suicide for Democrats, because what this bill does is it raises taxes on the middle class over time, and it lowers taxes on the richest Americans in the country. And not only that, now their proposal also includes a repeal of the individual mandate of the Affordable Care Act, which could facilitate a 10% increase in monthly health insurance premiums overall. So in opposing this bill, the Democratic Party is not being obstructionist. Surprisingly, they're on the side of the American people because this is a horrendous bill. Now, when you ask Donald Trump, he implies they've extended this olive branch to Democrats and said, hey, if you want to get your input into this tax reform proposal, then you need to come and talk with us. But since you guys are just being obstructionists, then we're not going to include any of your ideas in this bill. But when you actually talk with a respectable, truthful politician who doesn't lie every 2 minutes, Bernie Sanders, he doesn't necessarily agree with that narrative. This is what he had to say about Donald Trump's claim that the Democratic Party was being obstructionist in an interview on CNN with Jake Tapper.
Well, that's total nonsense. Democrats have been completely shut out of this process, just as they were shut out of the health care legislation process. Here is the fact, and Trump should understand this. What this legislation is about is fulfilling the promises, Republican promises, made to wealthy campaign contributors. There is a reason why the billionaire class provides hundreds of millions of dollars in campaign contributions to Republicans. And now is payback time. What this legislation is about, Jake, is giving 50% of the tax benefits to the top 1%. And at the end of 10 years in the House bill, forcing almost 50% of the middle class to actually pay more in taxes. What this legislation is about, absolutely insanely, is repealing the estate tax, a $269 billion tax break, not for the top 1%, but for the top 0.2%, a handful of the wealthiest families in this country, like the Walton family and the Koch brothers family and other very, very wealthy families.
So, Senator,
and by the way, Jake, one other point. When they run up a $1.5 trillion deficit, as they will in this legislation, they're going to come back, and that's what Paul Ryan is saying. They're going to come back with massive cuts to Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid because they say, oh my goodness, the deficit and the national debt are too high. This is a terrible, terrible piece of legislation, and it must be defeated.
So first of all, Bernie Sanders claims that the Democratic Party has been completely shut out of the process when it comes to tax reform. This is only the most believable claim ever, because when it came to their healthcare debate, as Bernie Sanders alluded to, they wouldn't even allow anyone to see the bill. They wouldn't even allow their own party to see the bill. So the Republican leadership, they hid this bill, this Obamacare repeal bill, away from most of their own party, wouldn't show it to the American people, wouldn't show it to the Democrats, and they made that same claim that Democrats don't want to work with them to repeal the Affordable Care Act. Well, first of all, even if they wanted to work with Republicans, you're not giving them an opportunity to work with you if you won't even show them the legislation, because when you are crafting bills, part of that process is allowing people to read it and propose feedback and say, look, I don't like this portion. I'd like to remove that. I want to propose an amendment here. I mean, that's part of the legislative process. But Republicans are preventing Democrats from doing that while in the same breath claiming that they are being obstructionists. No, simply not voting with you guys on this obscene piece of legislation, that's not being obstructionist. Again, that's just defending what the American people want. Now, Bernie Sanders made a really important point about the corruption that's fueling the Republican Party's push for tax reform. And I want to read his quote in entirety here. So he says, what this legislation is about is fulfilling the Republican promise made to wealthy campaign contributors. There's a reason why the billionaire class provide hundreds of millions in campaign contributions to Republicans. And now it's payback time. And Bernie Sanders is not just being hyperbolic. This is factual. This is an open secret, really, that a lot of people, they should be talking about a lot more frequently. The media should be talking about this. I mean, it's to the point now where corruption is so open in this country and so brazen in this country that the Republican Party's donors are literally publicly threatening to cut off the party from the piggy bank if they don't deliver in the form of tax breaks. So, for example, the Koch brothers network threatened to deny Republicans access to hundreds of millions of dollars, specifically $300 to $400 million, if the Republican Party doesn't actually deliver on tax reform, as well as a repeal of the Affordable Care Act, which is seemingly why the party is now all of a sudden trying to squeeze this repeal of the individual mandate into their tax reform legislation. Because, if the Koch brothers and their network actually sit out the midterm election, that would be devastating to Republicans. Now, it's not just the donors who are admitting this. Republicans themselves have made it clear that they know what's at stake. In fact, when Senator Lindsey Graham of South Carolina was asked what will happen if the GOP fails to deliver on their promise to cut their billionaire donors' taxes, Rebecca Sovransky of The Hill reports, quote, Graham specifically said that financial contributions will stop for the GOP. And, of course, he also talked about how incumbent Republicans might actually be primaried in 2018 if they don't come through and deliver on their promise to give massive tax breaks to their largest donors. Which probably means that their donors said, look, if you can't get this done, if you don't pass tax reform and give us tax breaks and give us this huge return on our investment, the investment being the contributions they provided to Republicans for their political campaigns, then they're basically saying, we're going to find someone who will. We will primary you and get someone in office who will actually deliver on these tax cuts that we want and we paid for. So, this is corruption. This is legalized bribery. Of course, this is no longer a criminalized practice in this country because we have campaign finance laws that allow for this type of open corruption. But, nonetheless, it's still corruption regardless if it's legal or illegal. Now, Bernie also says here that this bill will run up the deficit and the Republican Party will then propose cuts to Medicare, Medicaid, and Social Security to reduce the deficit. And this is such an important point because the Republican Party, they've done this before where they create problems and then they propose solutions to said problems that disproportionately fucks over the middle class. So in cutting taxes to the tune of trillions of dollars for the richest Americans in this country, you can't do that without finding a way to fund it unless you don't care about bankrupting this country and really running up the deficit. So, of course, this is what they're going to do. They're going to propose cuts to Medicaid, Medicare, and Social Security in order to pay for tax cuts to their billionaire donors. And look, this is no longer just speculation. Mitch McConnell, literally, we covered this last week. He admitted that we can no longer, guarantee that we won't be raising taxes on the middle class. Now, I want to show you another clip from this interview where Bernie Sanders responds to another argument that Republicans often cite to justify tax breaks to the richest 1% of Americans.
So Republicans' response to the idea that 50% is going to the top 1% is the top 1% pays a disproportionate amount of taxes. I do want to better understand your objection to this aspect of the bill. Is it the size of the tax cut going to the wealthy that bothers you, or the idea that the wealthy are getting any tax cut at all?
Well, first of all, what the Republicans are forgetting about is, the rich pay more in taxes because we have massive income and wealth inequality in America. 52% of all new income in America is going to the top 1%. Duh. Yeah, the rich are going to be paying more in taxes. But does anybody watching this program really believe that the major crisis facing our country, when the middle class is shrinking, when our infrastructure is falling apart, when young people can't afford to go to college or are leaving school deeply in debt, when 28 million people have no health insurance, does anyone really think that the major crisis facing this country is the need to give hundreds of billions of dollars in tax breaks to the very richest people in this country?
No, Bernie, nobody thinks that. And what's really mind-boggling to me is that Republicans, anytime they do something to screw over the American people, which is 99.9% of the legislation that they push, they almost always try to veil it and lie to us and get us to think that, what they're doing really will help us out in the end. But in this instance, I mean, they're not really trying to hide the fact that they are pushing for tax reform vociferously, specifically at the behest of their donors. I mean, you have the Treasury Secretary, Steve Mnuchin, admitting that repealing the estate tax specifically would help rich people the most. You also see Trump's National Economic Director and the former president of Goldman Sachs, mind you, Gary Cohn, admitting that CEOs are actually the most excited about the Republican tax plan. I wonder why that's the case. It's because this tax plan is just a huge gift to the Republican Party's donors, since they've been delivering and contributing to the campaigns of Republican politicians over the course of years and years and years. Now they're saying, finally, look, now that you're in office, now that you control all branches of government, it's time that we get a return on all this money we've been pouring into your campaigns. Now, in this interview, I'm going to show you one last clip where Bernie Sanders responds to another misconception about tax reform that is being pushed by the Republican Party.
The centerpiece of this tax bill is a significant reduction in the corporate tax rate. Is it not true that lowering corporate tax rates would encourage more companies to set up shop here in the United States and discourage them from doing it? It's not true.
No, it's not true in this sense. First of all, the Republicans are not telling the truth about the effective corporate tax rate. Nominally, it is 35%. Effectively, it's somewhere around 14 or 15%. Second of all, what they are trying to do is pass what is called a territorial tax program, which will, in fact, lower taxes for corporations that invest abroad. In fact, a very serious argument can be made that their legislation will result in the exodus of jobs from the United States, companies going abroad, paying lower taxes there. Our job right now is to end the absurdity of 1 out of 5 major profitable corporations in America today, not paying a nickel in federal taxes. Their legislation would make it worse. And by the way, Jake, what they are also doing is making permanent the corporate tax breaks, making temporary the tax breaks that benefit working families and the middle class. Absolutely crazy.
So to me, I think that's probably the most important thing that can be said about tax reform. Even though the nominal corporate tax rate is at 35%, well, that doesn't really matter because they're not paying 35%. These large multinational corporations, they take advantage of loopholes and they exploit our convoluted tax system. They take advantage of tax havens. And there's a reason why a lot of companies are actually paying $0 in taxes. And that's because our tax system does not hurt large multinational corporations. It has been watered down over decades and decades to benefit them. Now, companies that get away with paying $0 effectively includes American Airlines, GM, HP, Ventas, PG&E, Xerox, and News Corp, among others. So, I mean, if our corporate tax was effectively the highest in the world, not nominally, but effectively, then we wouldn't see all of these companies be able to so easily skirt paying any taxes whatsoever. Now, Jake Tapper also asked Bernie Sanders if it was true that cutting the corporate tax would encourage investment, would encourage these companies to invest in the United States. Now, we heard what Bernie Sanders said, but you don't even have to hear what Bernie Sanders has to say in order to determine that this is a bullshit claim, because when you actually ask CEOs themselves whether or not they'll use this extra revenue that they'll be getting from large tax cuts to invest in the United States, they say, not really.
Can I ask you all a quick question? If the tax reform bill goes through, do you plan to increase investment, your company's investment, capital investment, just a show of hands, if the tax reform goes through? Okay.
Why aren't the other hands up?
Why aren't the other hands up?
John, I've got a question for Gary quickly.
Seriously, why aren't the other hands up? Can't you guys see that I'm trying to push for tax reform here by lying to the American people and you're not helping me out? I mean, this is exactly what we see, and that was the most embarrassing moment, I think, probably in Gary Cohn's career, because here he is pushing this lie relentlessly, and all these CEOs, they admit, yeah, we're probably just going to pocket that money and, we're not going to invest back into the economy like you keep saying we will. So, I mean, we have to be clear. This is about reforming the tax code, not to make it simpler, not to make it less convoluted, but to allow large multinational corporations, millionaires and billionaires, to get a huge gift, a return on their investment for contributing to the campaigns of Republican politicians for decades. That's what this is about. This is not a bill that is centered around helping the middle class. They claim that doubling the standard deduction will be great for the middle class, and in theory that's true, but the middle class is still going to suffer if you pay for these tax cuts by cutting Medicare, Medicaid, and Social Security. So this is an egregious bill that has to be defeated, but it passed the House, it cleared the Senate Finance Committee, and it may very well pass the Senate. And if that happens, then you can guarantee that President Trump will be signing this into law. But we all need to know and realize what this is about. This is not about tax reform. This is about giving their donors a gift, plain and simple. And it's time that the Republican Party's own voters realize what their party is actually doing. It's pretty transparent.
Support this podcast by becoming a patron at patreon.com/Humanist Report.